Welcome to the Integral Stage. For this episode of Meta Models, I'm happy to welcome my friend and former professor, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens. I first met him almost 15 years ago at John F. Kennedy University, and in the time I've known him, he's contributed a lot of great things to the integral community, writing the seminal book on integral ecology, organizing several successful integral theory conferences, helping to launch the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice, founding the MetaIntegral organization, leading the Embodied Practitioner Certification Program, and more recently creating a course on exo-studies, which we explored in a previous episode on the integral stage. For today's discussion, we plan to focus on his metatheoretical work, mainly a meta model he calls complex integral realism, and also a couple wonderful meta tools, TetraDynamics and Polarity Dynamics. Layman, is there anything you'd like to add by way of introduction before we get started?
Just that it's a real pleasure to have Sean here. He's our comrade in the effort to encourage cross-pollination between metatheorists, and he's a real pioneer in integrating those pioneers who integrated a lot of other pioneers. Sean's a trailblazer in the art of taking it up a notch, so it would be mind-meltingly tragic not to have him on this series.
Awesome.
It sure would be. He should be the beginning and the end interview on our whole series.
It's great to be here, guys. I'm excited you're doing this series and happy to be part of it because it really taps into kind of my core passion. So it's good to be here.
Wonderful. Yeah, as we were just talking about, we'd love to hear your origin stories for your metatheorizing superpowers. What led you into integral theory in the beginning? Just what's the story of what got you into integral and the whole field of meta studies initially, and then what specifically was the genesis of your complex integral realism work or any of the other work that you've been doing?
Yeah, great. Well, I'm sure there's other tidbits from my past that are relevant, but a few details come to mind. Going way back to when I was very little. My mom often would comment about my ability to do puzzles, so I was like doing 500-piece puzzles that were for like teenagers when I was like 4. And there's this really uncanny ability I have when I do puzzles. I don't do them a lot, but my kids do them. And sometimes I'll walk by them working on it. And I just have this ability to like reach down and pick up a puzzle and just move and put it in the spot it goes. And it's happening without any kind of cognitive process. It's like some bizarre intuitive pattern recognition that's occurring below perception, or below any kind of conscious perception. And if I sit in front of the puzzle, I can often just kind of go boom, boom, just like, and my mind's thinking, holy like, how am I doing this? What is it? What's going on here? And so there's just from a very young age, there was just this capacity to be a big picture thinker and to see patterns and just kind of naturally, connect the dots, as it were. In college, when in high school, I had this whole kind of philosophy, of squeeze the sponge of life. Like this was this phrase that I would say to myself, that I wanted it all. I was so hungry for just like complete contact with reality, like think of like mixed martial arts with the cosmos, just like really wanted to, have a kind of not just mental view of reality, but like a deep dialogue, like making love with reality. Like, so there's, I have this very intense mind that wants to like see it all together, but connected to that is also just like this desire to just like roll around in the mud with reality, and just really like kind of see where that goes. In college, I tried to triple major, and this is where like some of my kind of intensity started to really come forward, because high school was so filled with angst and pimples and girls, and it's like it's just a different part of life. But by the time I got to college, I would take almost twice as many courses each quarter than my friends and colleagues, and as a result, I always had to go into the dean's office and get permission to take 5 classes when everyone else was taking 3, because we were on a quarter system at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And so when I graduated in 4 years, I had taken so many courses that it actually filled up 6 years of education. So I managed to squeeze 6 years of college into 4 because I took so many extra classes every single quarter. And in addition to that, I had a full-time job and I worked on campus, and I was an RA living in the dorms supporting, activities and, for my floor and all of that. When going back to high school, I remember the principal saying to my mom when I was graduating, he was a family friend, and he pulled my mom aside and said, Rhodey, my mom's name, says, we've seen a lot of kids come through here who are involved in a lot of activities, but I've never seen anyone who is involved in so many activities as Sean. And not only is he involved in so many activities, he's really excelling in all of them. Like, he's the president of Key Club. He's involved with the Just Say No Club. He's, doing sports. He's the photographer for the newspaper. He's on the debate team and so forth and so on. And it's true. Like, I had the longest list of kind of, extracurricular activities of anyone in the yearbook, and, and by a long shot. So again, it's kind of this desire for intimacy with reality and just like doing everything I can, like involved in so much. And involved not just like at a superficial level, but like really giving my all to pretty much every activity I'm involved in. And, up through grad school, and I even get this now sometimes, but not so much, but for about 10 years, the most common question people would ask me is, how do I do it all? Like, how do I do all these activities? And you recall, Bruce, when I was at JFK, I was running 2 programs. We were doing the conferences, there was the journal, there was a research center. Like, it was just like, it was a lot. And, and people always are wondering, like, how do you get all that done? And I don't know, like, so that's some part, there's something in all of that that's part of an answer to your question. It's like I've tried to meta-integrate with my whole body, with my whole heart, with my whole life. It's like, it's not just a mental process for me. And even when it is a mental process, it's like on steroids, and it's very cosmic. So when I left JFK and decided to go into business and launch MetaIntegral, coming up with that name, and I really thank Joanne Hunt from Integral Coaching Canada, because she suggested that name. And when I heard it for the first time, it was so clear and obvious that that's what I needed to call my company. And later, working with Jesse McKay with MetaIntegral Associates, like, he pointed out that is my teachable moment, that basically, meta integration is like the thing that I'm always doing. I'm always doing it. Like, it's my core embodiment. It's my unique self. I remember in AP English in high school doing this report and going to the library, when you had to look up each journal, and, it's like do interlibrary loan. And it was like a long process to, like, I got like 20 articles. And I went through all those articles and integrated them into my analysis of these books that I was reading. And I got such a high from that. Like, it's just, I still remember it, like 30 some years later. There was something about bringing the pieces together. So when I was trying to triple major in college, and I'd taken all these classes, and I went overseas and did a 6-month overseas trip. Then when I came back to, the United States, I lived in Portland for a while. Then I went to Peace Corps, and it was in Peace Corps that I discovered Wilber's work. And it was, the first book I read was Grace and Grit, because someone had given that to me, basically, as I was getting on the plane. And I love that book, but, it's not Ken's most kind of theoretical book. It's like a really nice mix of some of his early types of models and, his story with his wife, Treya. But I really deeply resonated with what he was doing there. And so after that, I spent 2 years in Chad, Africa, and I read over 200 books, of all kinds of topics, religion, philosophy, environmental studies, literature, poetry, and so forth. Just like everything I could get my hand on. And when I read Brief History of Everything, 2 years into that process, someone sent it to me in the mail. So I was in my little mud hut, and I still remember when the Peace Corps Range Rover pulled up which I hadn't seen another, American for like 3 months. And they come out with all the mail, and it's like, and there's this, gift, for my birthday, and it's a brief history of everything. And I was like, oh yeah, this is that guy I read a couple years ago, and I really love that book. I'm so excited that my friend, and it was the same friend who gave me Grace and Grit. She gave me Brief History of Everything because she was walking through a bookstore and saw that this new book from Wilber had come out and thought of me and grabbed it and sent it to me. And, to be honest, like, I feel like there was some kind of soul contract that we had where it was her job in our life to like give me those two books, because they've played such a pivotal role with everything since. I read that book in basically 24 hours. It had an intellectual satori, and where the 200 books I had just read over the last 2 years, plus, the 6 years of college that I'd crammed into 4 years, all just like were integrated in this giant, intellectual orgasm. And, and I think it was that was a really key moment in terms of kind of me kind of getting my meta integration, superpowers, like something clicked, something opened up, something shifted there. And so, I came back and started my master's degree. And even with integral ecology, which was my doctorate, that integrated 200 different schools of ecology, right? And so it's this, it's this obsessive compulsive capacity. It's like I couldn't do anything less than that to try and get the big picture. Even like, during grad school, I remember doing a paper on intersubjectivity. And so I went through all of Kin's writings and I retyped every section where he talked about intersubjectivity into a Word document. So I had all of those key quotes, in a single document, which ended up being like 20 or 30 pages, and so going through his entire body of work and tracking down every place I could where he's talking about that, right? So there's both like this real attention to detail, and there's also this really expansive viewpoint. Over the last, 10 years since I've launched MetaIntegral, there's been, 6 major meta models that I've been developing. And, and you're familiar with a few of them, but let me just kind of walk us through those so you just get a sense of kind of the range of, my sandbox, and kind of what I'm playing with here. There's complex integral realism, which we'll likely focus on today, which is basically my integration of Wilber's integral theory with Bhaskar's critical realism with Morin's complex thought. And that really emerged, at CIIS, I got exposed to Morin's work and really liked it. And then at the first integral theory conference in 2008, I got exposed to, via Mark Edwards, Roy Bhaskar's work. And also because I'd been such a deep student of Wilber's for a long time, I was starting to see kind of some of the limitations of integral theory, some of the strengths, some of the blind spots, and not just in the way that a lot of superficial critiques are, like from a very deep place of engagement with Wilber's work, seeing, areas that left something to be desired. And I saw how complex thought of Morin and critical realism of Bhaskar was a very nice complement to Wilber's work. And so this really propelled me to engage those viewpoints more. And then, with the third conference, we brought both of them as keynote speakers to, because I really wanted to expose the integral community to the notion that, hey, Wilber's is not the only integrative meta theory out there. There's others that are worthy of that designation, and we can learn a lot from them. So that was a really big moment, like giving my keynote speech at the third integral theory conference, where I kind of presented an earlier version of complex integral realism. And then we had a 4-year symposium that, Bruce, you were part of having, 10 to 15 critical realists and 10 to 15 integral theorists in deep ongoing dialogue over 4 years through a series of symposiums and, events and, paper writing and so forth. So having 2 communities of practice in deep dialogue where we really challenged each other's blind spots and strengths and really strove to explore kind of this trans lineage integrative orientation. Like that really left a deep impression on me of like the power, the potential, and the promise of that kind of collaborative scholarship. So complex integral realism in some ways kind of represents my biggest sandbox. And so all my other meta models are a derivative of that in some sense, or I try and link them up to complex integral realism, because part of what's going on in complex integral realism, even though it's not in the chapter I sent you guys, is a recognition that, the four quadrants, you can't just approach them from first and third person perspectives, that you can also approach them from a second person perspective. And this is something Wilber's not very good at. He's not very good with the we space, because he tends to collapse the entire we space into the notion of the we, or, which is basically intersubjectivity based on sameness. So in that model, there's not a lot of room for intersubjectivity based on difference or based on the other, right? And this is partly why Wilber doesn't have a lot of appreciation for postmodernism, because a lot of postmodernism is focused on the other opposed to the we. And so anyways, so I looked at the four quadrants and the 8 zones and realized that, why don't we have second person methodologies connected to each of the 4 zones? And so I started building out a whole approach to that. And when I did that, so like, for instance, in the upper left, you have phenomenology zone 1 and you have structuralism zone 2. But I place psychology as a dialogical method at like zone 1.5, if you will, right? Like the zone between 1 and 2, right? Because first person is what's going on in me. A third person is an objective viewpoint of the deeper structures of consciousness. But psychology in a general sense, like talk therapy, depth psychology, psychoanalytic psychology, is about a dialogical encounter. And there's ways in which the consciousnesses of the two people are influencing one another in that space. And that's entirely left out in Wilber's 4-quadrant 8-zone model. So I started to track the second person methods that are associated with the 4 quadrants. And Mark Edwards does a great job of critiquing Wilber in this area and really opened me up to seeing how I can make these meta model moves. And also when I did that, I discovered that Wilber's been critiqued for years about leaving certain pronouns out of his simple map, right? And Bruce, you've done a lot of work around the pronouns, which I love. And so I looked at the 4 or 5 people who were all kind of inside integral theorists who loved Wilber's work, but basically were saying, but hey, what about, these other pronouns, these other variations? They don't seem very well included in the simple 4-quadrant map. When I included the second person zones in, the 4-quadrant space, going from 8 zones to 12, all of a sudden I was able to integrate all the other pronoun maps that people had come up with, kind of pointing to ways in which Wilber's pronoun map was in some sense incomplete. So to me, that was like a kind of a moment of going, okay, I'm onto something, like this is really working. So that's another part of complex integral realism that I've been working on. But in addition to that, I've been working on the 4 centers, or the 3 wisdom centers. And, we did one presentation on that, the head, the heart, and the hara. And then also the halo, which is kind of the integrative higher self wisdom center. But I've looked at over 20 different traditions, contemplative traditions, that work with these 3 wisdom centers and have been integrating their practices and their insights around them. So, what Chinese internal medicine have to say about the 3 Dantians, and what the Celtic Christian tradition has to say about the 3 cauldrons, and what Sri Aurobindo has to say about the physical, vital, and mental, and what the Enneagram has to say about the body, the image and the mind, right? And so forth and so on. All these traditions are working with these 3 wisdom centers, and often pointing out that you have to activate and integrate the 3 wisdom centers in order to access and activate the 4th wisdom center, which I call the halo, in order to keep the alliteration of the H's going. And so this is another example of creating a meta model that's drawing on, over at this point, 25 different spiritual traditions that are working with these 3 centers and comparing and contrasting them in order to arrive at a deeper, wider kind of integrative framework for human development. Also, there's the meta-impact framework, which I've been developing using 10 different types of capital, right? So there's health and human, financial, manufactured, natural capital, social and cultural capital, knowledge, psychological and spiritual capital. All 10 types of capital are established in the literature. There's books and journals and articles and conferences and in each of those 10 types of capital. But nowhere has someone brought together all 10, and then I've used the quadrants to integrate them and have been developing a social impact framework of how to measure impact across these 10 capitals using first, second, and third person metrics. And that approach is based on the complex integral realism, not just Wilber's integral theory. So most people, when they look at it, they'll just kind of assume it's based on Wilber's work, which it is, but I use all 12 methodologies instead of the 8 associated with Wilber. So that's one of the core focuses of MetaIntegral as a business, is working on, those 10 capitals and helping organizations use them. And, we're currently developing an app, software app to help individuals and teams, work with those capitals. And so that's been a whole project. Also, I got an exo download a few years ago from some form of intelligence that basically tuned me into the Enneagram at a whole new level, and basically started developing 3D models of the Enneagram using sacred geometry and kind of cracking the code on the deeper patterns within the Enneagram, and have developed a series of almost 100 artistic plates of different geometric diagrams that essentially integrate the major 4 to 6 traditions of the Enneagram, right? From kind of the personality Enneagram and Gurdjieff's Enneagram and some of the more esoteric forms of the Enneagram. So this is another example of me, coming up with, and I never really studied sacred geometry before this download, but I had this mashed potato moment where I kept building these models out of this like totally weird, obsessive, kind of impulse. And I had 2 different types of models, and I was really frustrated because I couldn't figure out how they came together. And then eventually I figured it out and was able to kind of integrate these 2 kind of sets of geometric designs into a single geometric design, and which basically is 15 octahedrons integrated to create a meta-octahedron. An octahedron is basically like the 4-pointed pyramid, but on both sides, right? And so when I created this meta-octahedron with 15 sub-octahedrons in it, I had this like pop where I realized like that it was like some inner part of me recognized that's what I was trying to create. It was almost like, my soul recognized like, oh, there it is. You got it. You finally got it. And then the impulse disappeared, that mashed potato impulse, because I was staying up to like 1 or 2 o'clock every night after the kids went to bed, trying to figure this out and building these models. And then when I got to that point, it was like the outer expression matched some unconscious inner knowing, some kind of gnosis that was like, oh, okay, there it is. You did it. You finally got what was inside you. You got it outside you, and now you can see it and other people can see it. So there's all this work on the harmonic Enneagram that for me highlights that the Enneagram is not just a map of the personality in the ways that we tend to think of it, but it's actually a map of reality in this really profound way. And that essentially the hit that I got was this meta-octahedron is essentially a sound technology and is connected to free energy, right? Because it's basically but anyway, so it's just like, oh my God, it's like totally wild. Then there's the metadynamics material, and I sent you guys a couple things from that. And the metadynamics is basically me taking the 5 major components of integral theory, quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, and doing a meta move on them, right? And so looking at, the quadrants and what are all the different ways we can understand and create the quadrants and quadrants of quadrants of quadrants of quadrants, and just kind of like, just going deep into the quadrants of quadrants and calling it TetraDynamics. Like, what are all the dynamics between the quadrants? And then polarity dynamics is looking like at all the different dynamics with polarities that are happening, and different theorists of polarities have explored that. And so there's different polarities in each of the 4 quadrants, right? And so polarity dynamics is kind of mapping those different types of polarity dynamics in each of those areas. And polarities represents the type element. Then energy dynamics looks at states in all 4 quadrants. And spectrum dynamics looks at levels and lines in all 4 quadrants. And with that, I studied, the 10 major systems of adult development, that really had good research behind them. And a lot of people have seen like those charts where you have all the major lines of, Commons and, Keegan and, all of that, Cook-Reuter. So I basically studied, the best models of that and looked at the different ways they talk about development, and brought those insights together into a whole system called spectrum dynamics. And so metadynamics is just, the combination of those 4 major components that then come together. And then lastly, and most recently, it's been exo-studies, and developing a meta approach to UFOs and non-human intelligences and our interactions with those. And looking at the 10 major theories of non-human intelligences and integrating those into what I call the mutual enactment hypothesis, right? Which I think does a good job of accounting for the valid aspects of each of those other 10 views of what we're dealing with here, but then takes, a meta-integrative view of it. So those are the 6 major areas of my meta-integration: complex integral realism, the 3/4 wisdom centers work, metadynamics, meta-impact with the 10 capitals, exo-studies, and the harmonic enneagram, right? And so those are all active projects that I'm working on. And much of it I haven't published. Much of it is just stuff that kind of working on in my man cave that at some point, will see the light of day, hopefully. So let me stop there because I know I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, that's a ton of stuff. That's terrific. I mean, I'd like to dig into almost all of it. I'm really interested in, Gurdjieff has 3 wisdom centers, but he doesn't use the hara. Right? So I would like to go into that. I would like to go into those 10 forms of capital because I'm really interested in the possibility of a 4-quadrant currency to stabilize the metrics in those different domains. But I guess to keep it on track, I should ask, like, what in your view are the essential components needed to build a meta model? Wilber's given us this nice little grab bag of states and levels and lines and types and shadow and states. So he puts them together in a certain way. Do you think he's correct about what the major components are? Are there things he's left out? Are there things we don't need? What are the categories of stuff that you absolutely need in order to do meta level work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have found, like, I use the aqua elements in a lot of what I do, but not all of what I do. I do agree that they are primary patterns of reality. So they absolutely are a good starting point. I have found the I, we, and it, which is obviously a version of the quadrants, to be a more fundamental pattern to work with in my meta model work. And in some ways, even more dynamic and versatile than the 4 quadrants. And so I find the I, we, and it shows up in almost all of my meta modeling. And also it's that, at one point I made a list of, like, every time I came across an author who was using some semblance of the I, we, and it, I would write it down, and then I would write the terms they were using for, the subjective sphere, the intersubjective sphere, the objective sphere. And at one point I had like over 20 different authors listed, and none of them, very few of them were familiar with Wilber. And I would say none of them were using their 3 terms as a result of Wilber, like they had arrived at it themselves. So I think this highlights kind of the value of the I, we, and it, and also kind of, because if you study triangles and triadic systems, there's a natural holistic harmonic that comes with 3s. And so, which is different than kind of the stability of 4s, like with the quadrants. So I think, at a minimum, working with the I, we, and it in whatever form is helpful. The thing that has been kind of core to almost all of my meta modeling has been the who, how, and what. This started in my work with integral ecology, and then, it's become crucial for almost all the different meta models that I just walked through with you guys. And so the who is the epistemology, the how is the methodology, and the what is the ontology, right? And so, some theories focus on one or the other, or two. Very few focus on all three. Even in complex integral realism, I make the case that Wilber is most strongly situated in the epistemological I domain, Bhaskar similarly in the we or philosophy domain, and then Morin in the complexity it domain, with each of them having a secondary and a tertiary strength in the big three, and then together they really complement one another. But for me, it's like to work with, like, who are we talking about? Like, where's the consciousness coming from in the system, right? And so focusing on the who and the awareness of the observer, and then what methods are they using to investigate reality, and then what are they aiming their methods at? Like, which aspects of reality are they focused on? Working with the who, how, and what has helped me get a meta view very quickly over and over again as a way of coordinating how different approaches are situated in the landscape of reality. Because I can go, okay, it's kind of like it's a shorter version of cosmic address, right? For me, like, I like the idea of cosmic address. I think, some of the versions that Ken and Clint Fuse got into with, like, all the variables, like, it made sense, but it often wasn't very practical. So to me, the who, how, what is like a very easy, quick, and dirty way to kind of get my meta-integral vantage point on any particular approach and see, is this an approach that tends more to focus on the what? Are they reflective of the how? And do they even include or acknowledge the consciousness of the who, right? Or, some variation of that. So that gives me the vantage point. And then, I think for me, a big part of the meta modeling is a lot of epistemic reflexivity and a lot of epistemic humility, right? And being really aware of my own biases, preferences, personality dynamics, tendencies, because it's like I really have to try and get out of my own way to do good meta model building, right? And I see a lot of attempts at meta modeling where people are really kind of unconscious to their personality dynamics, their karmic dynamics, their levels in line, so I see that as really key, because otherwise your meta model is just a mirror reflecting you back. I mean, it always is ultimately anyways, but it's like you're kind of wanting to reduce the amount of distortion in the field, right? And so, kind of that deep kind of self-inventory of, what are my strengths and limits, and why am I drawn to these types of thinkers or these types of applications, and and as a way of kind of being taking a meta view on your own meta model building, right? Like, to me, that's been really crucial, and why the meditative and contemplative and esoteric traditions are so important for me as a meta model builder, because it really serves that reflective process.
Turning a little bit to a discussion of the complex integral realism, focusing in there just a little bit, each one of the fields that you're drawing from, each one of the metatheories that you're drawing from is, a whole integrative metatheory, meaning it contains
Right.
a universe in itself. Each one of them is trying to be comprehensive about reality, right? And so each one of them involves, a great deal of material, of perspectives. And so when I was first getting into my own explorations of intersections, especially between critical realism and integral theory, and I would write a little bit about it or talk about it in the integral community, a lot of integral people came back to me and said, why are you doing that? Why is it necessary? They're enormous things. You're going to make things overly complicated, overly clumsy. You're going to ruin the chances for integral to get out into the culture because it's too much to take in. They came at me with a lot of criticisms, and of course I actually continued to defend the value of that marriage, or at least that courtship. But I wanted to know, what is your response to such critiques?
Yeah, fair enough. Like, those are great points, but I feel like there's often a layer of anti-intellectualism in those kinds of critiques. Like, they're missing something. It's like, sure, like it's on us, people like you and I, Bruce, to, keep in mind that, we're at risk of making things overly complex, like that, but it's like the mountain's there. We got to climb it. We're integrative by nature. Like we want to try and understand this. So, it's like when I went to Peace Corps and people are like, why are you going there to help people in Africa? Like, we need a lot of help here in America. It's like, yeah, but there's a lot of people here in America helping people in America. Like, I feel a calling to go overseas and become more of a global citizen and do that in the context of supporting a local community. And I am aware of a lot of the complex geopolitical dynamics, and and that I was sent to Chad because America wanted to keep access to oil and all that. It's not it's not a simple, straightforward process. But it's like why not have people like look at someone like you and go, wow, like I would never do that. I'm so glad you're doing it. Go for it, Bruce, and and do it in a way where we can make use of it later. So I appreciate those critiques, but I just don't give them a lot of energy, because I know for me, my path is meta integration, and there's a lot of pitfalls, and I want to learn what those are, and I want to minimize them. But it's like, I want to squeeze the sponge of life. Like I want to be intimately connected to reality, and integral theory has a lot of limitations. And if I just hang out there, it's not ultimately satisfying. I need to go beyond it. I need to take integral theory as object, right? And that was a big part of bringing in Bhaskar and Morin to the conference, was to help the whole community, in that third conference, to take integral theory as object and to be able to operate on it, to critique it, to look at it and go, oh yeah, like here's where it's great, here's where it could use some help. Because like one simple difference is Wilber's approach is really good for individual enlightenment. It's really not very good for social emancipation, right? Bhaskar's approach has really powerful tools and distinctions and techniques for supporting a discourse around social emancipation. Wilber doesn't really have a theory of power and transformation at a societal level that I've seen really well developed. Bhaskar does, right? Bhaskar doesn't have such a strong approach to individual awakening and enlightenment, because he doesn't have as well a developed view of psychology and the soul and the human being the way integral theory does, right? So those just are like two examples. It's like, if I want integral theory to help transform the world, how can I do that when it has a really emancipated theory of social change, and it doesn't really understand social change, right? I need to go outside integral theory to get that. And oh, look, here's a turquoise level, approach to philosophy of science that, has an amazing model that's quite complex and difficult, but ultimately offers new ways of developing critique of institutions to move us towards a better society, right? And I think that's why the symposium of having that group of scholars from each side in deep dialogue with one another, like, to me, like, that's where the action is. Like, it's not just about me being in my man cave and like coming up with my models and my maps and my diagrams and being all proud of myself. It's like, how do we enter into deep conversation with others who are similarly engaged with these ideas? And how do we build new models and ways of applying these models together? And why a series like this that you're doing is really helpful, because it helps that cross-pollination of all these people who are doing meta modeling but aren't aware of each other, right? Or how we might take ideas from each of the episodes you're doing and apply them to different domains.
So there's a kind of question around how this helps us move toward a better society, because I think it's pretty obvious that if you had people with more integrative psychology, that they have an individual benefit already. There's a social benefit to having people who have these kinds of minds. But what's the specific benefit of having a good, coherent, intertheorist meta model, like a really good integrative or transintegrative map?
Right.
Is that just a fun mountain to climb and a peculiar spiritual path for certain white guys with beards? Or is there some real public utility to getting the model right going forward?
Yeah, both. I mean, I think, it can be both, right? It can just be, the project of a handful of white guys with beards, and, it's just their mental masturbation, and it's fun and interesting, and it makes for a few good peer-reviewed journal articles, right? So it can be just that. And on a certain level, like, I'm okay with that. Like that's interesting. It's as interesting as a lot of other possible activities. At the same time, I think it does hold the promise of something more than that. And, but that's where the dialogue and the community of practice comes in. Like I have a PhD in philosophy, and, you can look at someone like Kant, who's really difficult to read, and say, oh, well, it's not worth my time. But, Kant changed the world. Like, we're still living under, the iron grip of Kantianism, and it's really determined how we understand reality. And if you want to change reality, you really have to, understand what it is, what is reality, right? And challenge, current dominant narratives of what is reality. So I think evolution of society and consciousness individually seems to be largely driven by differentiation that then allows for higher orders of integration. So I think at their best, these models and maps and these, kind of approaches that might be engaged by a handful, we need to find ways to support differentiation, right, around what's possible. And with that comes expressive capacity, right? So like, how do we increase expressive capacity in different areas? Because like before Wilber really made the notion of developmental levels popular, like that differentiation of the stream of consciousness into 5 to 8 or 9 different levels or structures of awareness, when we have that differentiation, it becomes very useful and very powerful. And there's a lot of ways we can apply it and misapply it, misappropriate it, and use it. But that differentiation is essential to being able to have different kinds of conversations. So likewise with the meta capital work I do, a lot of people talk about financial capital. Sometimes they'll talk about social and natural capital or human capital. Sometimes they'll talk about manufactured capital. So their capital is differentiated into 3 to 4 other kinds of capital that allows a certain kind of conversation. And so in the triple bottom line initiatives, right, that emphasize, people, planet, and profit, they're using an expanded notion of capital, multiple kinds of capital, and how to coordinate and understand their relationships. In my approach in that space, like I felt that the people, planet, profit have been really hijacked by the systems thinking and like third person metrics. And it's really left out subjective well-being and kind of the, the upper left and the lower left, right? The experience and the culture. So we have this people, planet, profit, but it still kind of ends up getting reduced to kind of a third person systemic way of understanding those realities, right? It's not including the interiors. So my 10 capital approach like further differentiates the space and anchors it in the literature where people are already talking about those types of capital. So it's not like I made up a term, psychological capital. It's like it's been used for 20 years, actually since the 80s, 40 years. And there's a whole body of literature around it. But I brought that differentiation into a larger conversation around these other kinds of capital. And it allows us to have a different conversation about wellness, human wellness, and community wellness, because we have more expressive capacity, right? We're able to have a different conversation because we have a set of distinctions that's useful. So to bring this back around, my hope, and I think the burden on us meta modelers is it's good for us to keep an eye on how are we supporting expressive capacity through our models that are helping to create helpful distinctions so that we can have the conversations we need to have in order to move things forward in the right direction. If our meta models are not doing that, then I would say they are an example of what you said earlier about just white guys with beards, just, publishing in obscure academic journals, and who gives an F, But I think to the extent that we can, come up with distinctions that increase expressive capacity, and then we can introduce those distinctions into communities of discourse so that we can have new kinds of conversations that include more elements of reality, right? Because when you look at the 10 capitals, for instance, I got real excited because one of my first published article in a peer-reviewed journal was in the Journal of Bhutan Studies when I lived in Bhutan for 6 months, and I was trying to explain how gross national happiness could be measured, right? Because they had this great idea of gross national happiness, but they had no idea how to measure it. So I used basically integral methodological pluralism as a basis to talk about how they can measure gross national happiness in an I, we, and it fashion. And I published it there. Then more recently, was looking at gross national happiness and their new website and all the work they've done on it. They have 10 dimensions that they track and measure for gross national happiness. 8 of them match on directly to 8 of the capitals in my system, right? So it highlights that they differentiated the conversation over many years in order to figure out how to measure gross national happiness. They arrived at a model with 10 distinct factors that they could isolate and measure. And so they had to differentiate the space enough to be able to operationalize it. So I think something similar is at play with the best meta models, that they're able to kind of do that in some sense.
Yeah, I also run into that. People are concerned that this kind of activity is an indulgence and doesn't have actual social capital to it. But I really find playing in this area and investigating and as you say, squeezing that sponge of life, it's actually a way of entering into deeper dialogue with reality. And when you get the terrain that it's mapping, it's not abstract. It's
Right.
in a sense, there's a whole embodied dimension to it. One thing I wanted to ask you about with relation to the complex integral realism is, it consists of several different components, and I wanted to ask you to kind of highlight one part of it.
Yeah.
From my side of things, when I look at things from my integral grammatology, I see like the value of what I'm calling autochoreography and what you're doing with the 6 W's. For me, that's what happens when you intersect the pronouns with the adverbs.
Right.
And it expands the territory for what you can work with and how you can theorize and interrelate within a metatheory, but also between metatheories. So I wanted to ask if you could just, take a little time to go into the 6 W's. I know you touched on it a little bit before with the 3, but yeah, just to expand that a little bit.
Yeah, so complex integral realism gets its name because I'm taking one word from each of the 3 major theories that I'm trying to integrate. So complex thought gives us complex, integral theory gives us integral, and critical realism gives us realism. So complex integral realism is kind of an amalgamation of those 3 theories' names. Within CIR, complex integral realism, there's 3 major frameworks that I develop. One is called a metadisciplinary framework that basically provides a way of integrating like hundreds of disciplines in a coordinated way to have the pearls of wisdom from all of those kind of, go to the surface so that they can be, utilized. And similarly in exo-studies, I have a framework for metadisciplinarity that integrates 150 different disciplines, 50 disciplines from academic and philosophical literature, 50 disciplines from UFO and space studies, and 50 disciplines more or less from esoteric and paranormal literature, right? So part of CIR is having a way of like, how do you bring together so many different disciplines and coordinate them in a way that's useful without getting overwhelmed? So the metadisciplinary framework is one piece of that, and there's like 4 orders, Another framework is the integral pluralism matrix, which is the 6 W's that you talked about, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Then the 3rd framework is what I call the ontological domains lattice, which basically takes Bhaskar's stratified ontology of the empirical, the actual, and the real, and crosses it with the big 3, the I, we, and it, to look at how those 3 levels of ontology occur in all 3 areas so that you get natural ontologies, social ontologies, and psychological ontologies, right? So these 3 big frameworks, each as a meta model, come together to create a meta model of complex integral realism. Coming back to your question about integral pluralism, so there's the 6 W's, which refers to, at the core is the who times how times what, right? And so this is frame that I use in almost all of my meta modeling. And then we talked about that, right? The epistemology, the methodology, and the ontology. And so I think of it as integral epistemological pluralism, which is levels and types. Integral methodological pluralism, which is Wilber's 8 zones, or my 12 zones if we add the second person zones to the map. And then integral ontological pluralism, right, which is in a sense that map of the stratified 3 levels of strata of ontology from Bhaskar combined with the I, we, and ed of Wilber, right? Because the quadrants can be viewed as a what, a how, or a who. Right. When we talk about the quadrants as a who, we're talking about the quadrivia of my own awareness looking out at the world through those 4 windows. When we're talking about it as, or rather, that's the quadrants. I'm sorry. So the quadrants are how they're embedded in me, right? The quadrivia is then using the quadrants to look at something from 4 angles. That's the what. And then the quadrants as methodology is the zones, right? The 8 zones or 12 zones. So you can take something like the quadrants as a meta model, but then you have to ask, am I using it in a who way to understand the 4 quadrants of my own dimensionality and awareness? Am I using it as a what way in order to focus on 4 different aspects of reality that have some kind of ontological status? Or am I using them as the zones in a how way to coordinate methodologies, right? So it's not that the quadrants are inherently a what framework or a who framework or a how framework. It can be used in any of those, right? And this is where a lot of confusions around the quadrants come in, because sometimes people will use 2 of the quadrants in a what way and 2 of the other quadrants in a who way, and it creates a bit of a categorical mismatch. So the who times the how times the what brings in integral ontological pluralism. And this is something that Wilber doesn't really do well with. He doesn't include this. He's really good at integral epistemological pluralism and integral methodological pluralism. But I basically, when I saw those patterns and knowing the TetraDynamics nature of all of this, I just said, well, there has to be an integral ontological pluralism. So what is it? How do we talk about it? Right. And that was part of what drove me to Bhaskar's work, was because I needed to understand ontology better in order to build out the notion of integral ontological pluralism. So those are the 3 W's. And then those 3 W's are situated in time and space. So the where and the when, right? And I will often put those kind of above and below the 3 in a line. And then those are in a circle. All of that's in a circle. So those are the 5 W's. And then the 6th W is the why. And this is integral theoretical pluralism. And so I use complex thought, critical realism, and integral theory to get my theoretical pluralism, right? To look at all of this. And in the chapter I sent you, and you can post that or give a link to it for folks, I give an example of also looking at salmon industry through the 6 variables of the W's as to try and, make it more concrete. But it's also, what's nice about it is, so you can look at the 6 W's with all these 6 different types of pluralism: integral theoretical pluralism, integral ontological pluralism, and so on. And so that's all very abstract and very kind of overwhelming mentally. But these are also the core elements of good journalism. The 6 W's are just like how you write a good story, and so I love it, because on the one hand, it has this very simple, basic kind of quality of accessibility, but it also can be amplified to the nth degree of holding, 6 very different and complex types of pluralism, epistemological, ontological, methodological, theoretical, and so forth, right? And so it scales from the very simple to the very complex, and you can play that scale however you want. A lot of times I will only use the 3 W's, the who, how, and what, but if I need to bring in the others, I can, right? And so this has been a key part to my meta model building, is kind of an accordion approach, where, like with the 10 capitals, a company doesn't have to use all 10. They could just use 3 or 4, but they're now aware of all 10, right? Someone doesn't have to use all 12 zones, but they're aware of all 12 zones, and they can focus on which ones. People don't have to use all 6 W's, but they're aware of all 6 W's, and they can choose which ones, right? So I try and build models that don't commit the user to the full map, but rather provide a full map for a better view, but then they can kind of choose subsets of that map to use depending on their uses and what they're trying to apply it, so that they can scale it to their situation. Because it's too much to kind of, but sometimes people are so excited about their big model, they frame it and they present it in a way that kind of expects and demands users to use the whole map. And I find it's often too much and not necessary.
I really like the notion of the W's. It's not only sort of colloquial and easy to grasp, but I think it has the added benefit of shifting us away from our over-reliance on optical metaphors, right? Perspectives and lenses and viewpoints. We could just think of it in terms of questions. That's a beautiful thing. I think it's easy for a lot of people to understand epistemological and methodological pluralism, but ontological pluralism seems very peculiar, and probably should seem peculiar. Beyond conceptions of how to do that, like Bhaskar's version of types of reality, at a very fundamental level, what does reality have to be like in order for ontological pluralism to be a valid description of reality?
Yeah, that's a very Bhaskarian way of asking the question. In fact, that's like his core question, like, what does reality have to be like for science to be legitimate and to give us access to that world? The reason ontological pluralism is so counterintuitive to us Westerners is because if you look at the work of Philip Descola, a French anthropologist, he's done a very nice job of identifying the four major ontological strategies that the world over, from time immemorial, as best we can tell, have used these four different strategies in various ways, right? So they're kind of, he presents them as pure types, but he acknowledges that in any given culture or community, you'll have kind of some mixtures and hybrids, and and in different situations, people might pick and choose what's convenient for them in terms of their own metaphysics, but that at the core of the culture, there will usually be one of these four types as dominant. I'll just focus on two of them because they are really illustrative to, I think, the part of the point you're asking about. So Western naturalism has an ontology that says there's a singular nature and there's a multiplicity of interiors, right? What we might call multiculturalism and mono-naturalism. One world, a lot of different viewpoints on that world, right? This is very much encapsulated in the blind man and the elephant metaphor, that there's a real elephant and it's there, and we have all these different epistemological viewpoints on this one singular ontological reality called the elephant. So that's the core Western kind of approach. And you see this bifurcation in the academy in terms of the sciences having kind of almost a naive realism, and postmodernism having this like a-perspectival madness of all the interiors and different viewpoints and all that. So you have this real schism in culture and in thinking around one camp that really emphasizes the multiculturalism and another camp that really emphasizes the mono-naturalism. Hold on a second. Doing a little cooking here, COVID style. So what's interesting is with animism, particularly with the Amerindians, in South America and Brazil, but this is true for a lot of forms of animism, they literally have the exact opposite ontology and metaphysics, and that is a multiple nature and a singular interiority. And so this is why they tend to ascribe agency to rocks and trees and animals, and everything has personhood, right? Because that's the singular interiority. Everything has agency and or personhood. And so that's shared by all things in like a singular kind of metaphysical sense. But then in terms of bodies are multiple. Bodies and worlds are multiple. So you have the shamans shape-shifting in their bodies to access different worlds and the multiple worlds. So in those cosmologies, the Amerindian cosmologies, you have the exact opposite ontological metaphysical scheme than the Western one. So here's the $1 million question. When you think of those two, and we could also talk about the other two that Philip Descola talks about, totemism and analogism, but we won't get into that for now. But then it's like, well, which one's right? which one's more right than the other? No, like it's not that Western naturalism is more right. It's not that the view of a singular nature is more right than this view of a multiple nature, right? It's true insofar as that the kind of science that we've developed appears to be good, assuming there's a singular nature. But then when you look at the work of Anne-Marie Mol and her stuff, she's a Dutch kind of ethnographer, looks at this disease and how this disease is enacted in the hospital system, how different specialists research the disease and report the disease and map the disease, and how the x-rays do this, and and basically points out that each one has a slightly different view of the disease and understands it and defines it differently, so that there actually isn't a singular disease by that name. All these different methods enact a slightly different version because the how is bringing together the who and the what. So there's never a what without the who and the how, right? And so this is part of understanding ontological pluralism, is that and it's similar to the wave particle stuff in quantum, that there's a way the methods we use participates with the what. And has a role in co-creating or enacting in some sense within parameters, right? It's not like I can wish to have a Ferrari and boom, there it is, all of the secret. But there's more dance, there's more play, like there's not a singular nature in the way that we often think. And so when you look at these different cosmologies and these different strategies, you start to come to the conclusion that while the Western naturalism strategy is a good one, it's not the only one, and therefore it's not the last word on the nature of reality. So part of the challenge is, how do we develop the notion of ontological pluralism and translate it into a Western sensibility that is overly committed to the idea of a singular nature? Like, it's almost like we can't even think outside that box. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to us. But when you start studying these other traditions and the examples they give, like, it starts to loosen up, or you read Anne-Marie's book, and you start to see kind of how, and I try to do this with the climate change article of 2010, that all these different climate scientists are looking at climate change through the methodology akin to their profession, and it's enacting a different layer of it. Now, there's still something we call climate change, where we kind of assume they're all pointing at the same thing. We all assume that they're blind men with the elephant. I'm suggesting maybe that's not the best metaphor, right? Maybe that's just a partial way of understanding what's going on. Maybe there's different different elephants, and not just the same elephant, right? Or slightly different variations of the elephant, right? That are being collapsed in different quantum ways. Like I just think reality, especially when you look at the exo stuff and the paranormal and the ufological stuff, that reality is much more multidimensional, multi-phasic than we often realize. And I think as we come out of this kind of reduction, materialist, secular understanding of nature and reality, we're going to need to have some models and maps that help explain a more dynamic ontology than what our current Western science is apt to admit to.
There are arguments to be made, I think, that something like the perception of a hyperobject depends on the ability to take meta perspectives. And for me, that's an example of this participatory nature of disclosing ontological worlds or ontological dimensions. And so, yeah, there's this whole element of, I think, of participation in this, discussion here and in this perspective. And so related to that for me is your inquiry into polarities and the importance of polarities within the overall integral model, or in an integral metatheory. And I'd like to explore that with you. I don't know if you still feel, I saw in some of your writings that you've played with the idea, is it fair to consider polarity an additional element,
right,
alongside the other five and Aquil, or not? You've heard some of our discussions earlier in the series, and we've talked about prepositions or relational ontologies, and my sense is possibly relations is something that is not really adequately covered in the Aquil model. And to me, polarity is pointing at that. So I'd like to hear just your riffs on polarity and relationship and additional aqua elements.
Yeah, and I think your focus on relationships is in part the result of what I was talking about before, where because Wilber reduces the second person to the we space in the lower left, opposed to seeing how it's part of all four quadrants, that you get a very anemic view of relationality and intersubjectivity. And there's a lot more to be gained by realizing that it's not just a what. So, I think Wilber's correct to, in a sense, to put the lower left, the intersubjective in the lower left from an ontological perspective, if you look at the quadrants as a what map. But from a how map, then you need the second person to be in all four quadrants. And he doesn't do that. He only has the first and third person in all four quadrants. So, based on my familiarity with your work, Bruce, and just kind of what you're saying now, like I think you and I are both, and others have grappled with kind of sensing that there's something not fully satisfying about the integral theory and its treatment of relationship and the second person. The polarities, I do feel it is an additional element, right? Because I think the definition that I recall Ken using as to whether or not something is an element, like types, states, lines, levels, is that it has to appear in all four quadrants, right? So in a sense, quadrants is the uber element, right? Because everything else is subordinate to the quadrants in some important way, right? Levels are all in four quadrants, lines are along the levels in all four quadrants. There's states in all four quadrants, and there's types in all four quadrants, and there are polarities in all four quadrants. And and I think others have talked about this, but I think it's a very exciting and interesting thing to add polarities to the aqua, kind of lineup, and I think kind of in a sense they're even more primordial than quadrants, because in my analysis of polarities, the quadrants emerge out of polarities. The quadrants are two polarities themselves, inside and outside, individual and collective, right? So the quadrants are a polarity. They're two polarities, interfaced with one another. And then, in the polarity dynamics work, I talk about kind of the cosmic story of polarities, where you have the pregnant void, and then Shiva and Shakti, basically consciousness and energy, is a polarity, and then Shiva breaks into subjectivity and objectivity, and Shakti breaks into the one and the many, right? And then those two additional polarities basically become the four quadrants, right? And so I think you could come up with, different cosmological origin stories for the four quadrants. But I was very fascinated with, like, where did they come from? Where did the four quadrants come from? Why are they so primordial? Why are they so important? Why are all the other elements a derivative or somehow subsequent to the quadrants? And this led me into this analysis that, the quadrants are birthed out of two core polarities, right? And you get the one and the many, and then the subjective and objective. And then also it's like, when you look at, there's these six core polarities that I identify in polarity dynamics. And so they're basically, you have the four quadrants, and you can imagine a polarity between any of the quadrants, including diagonally. This gives you six polarities. And these six polarities are basically like, experience and behavior, behavior and system, experience and culture, culture and system, and so forth, like all four quadrants and all the combinations that they can make in terms of polarity. When you look at the history of philosophy and even sociology and many of the other kind of social and natural sciences, the core issues at the heart of many of them are basically these six polarities, because you can translate those six polarities into mind and body, self and other, agency and structure, free will and functional fit, culture and nature. These six polarities, like translated into, kind of those terms, are the six core polarities that Western Civ has been trying to figure out. And different disciplines will focus on, oh no, it's nature, no, it's nurture, no, it's self, no, it's other, right? Psychology needs to have an intersubjective component, focus on the other. No, it needs to be introspective, focus on the self, right? Institutions are driven by agency of actors. No, it's the structures that kind of organize it all in some unconscious systemic way, right? Like, all of these are just different camps that are emphasizing one pole in these polarity dynamics. And the power, this is why I think the power of the quadrants is as big as it is because if you have a 4-quadrant approach and you include all 4 quadrants, you are managing the 6 core polarities at the basis of the Western mind and at the basis of Western philosophy and Western society, right? And so you're naturally trying to include the elements of all 6 poles and in a balanced way. And so that this makes the 4 quadrants, if you use nothing else from integral theory, you just use the 4 quadrants, then you're tending to these 6 core polarity dynamics kind of without even knowing it. And then that's what partly makes the 4 quadrants so powerful, is because it kind of, sneak in a way of dealing with these 6 core polarities. But then you can go beyond that with polarity dynamics and all the charts that I've done. And the thing is with each of these kind of bodies of work, polarity dynamics, TetraDynamics, spectrum dynamics, I basically have created 100 charts for each one of them, mapping out all kinds of permutations. And part of that is just my mind trying to see all the different possible ways this can look. And admittedly, only about 20% of those diagrams are actually useful, but I can't get to that 20% unless I kind of figure out all the different possibilities, and then I can start to see which ones are useful in which context, right? So, there's polarities in states, there's polarities in types, there's polarities in levels, there's polarities in lines. And in fact, polarities seem to drive development in all of those elements, right? So like the Enneagram, you have your core type and then you have your wings. Well, the wings are basically a polarity in relationship to your core type. And then also your integration point and your disintegration point are additional polarities. So basically the whole map of the Enneagram is basically the process of navigating 5 to 7 different polarity dynamics that are exerting force on your personality, and how you determine to navigate those polarities determines in large part your personality structures. Same with states, waking, dreaming, sleeping, or, happy and sad, there's all these ways in which polarity dynamics actually are kind of the engine within all the elements. So in this sense, I would say, to come back to the point, and I made it earlier, but I think I'll just emphasize and stop here, that polarities as an element is actually more primordial than quadrants. So I would say all polarities, all quadrants, and then level sign states and types, right? So I think polarities is a big piece that kind of the integral community has missed. There's people like Bina Sharma who are working on it, and others, who have done some great work around polarities. But I think it's a gold mine that remains to be engaged a lot more than it has been.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the tetradynamics of ideology. Ideology not in the sense of we have a belief system, but in the kind of critical theory sense that the material conditions and the systems that are operating show up in us as a false consciousness, that kind of idea. And if you expand that out with the quadrants, you get this idea that something from one of the other quadrants is inserting itself into a different quadrant, right? That an individual's consciousness has been partly replaced by their material conditions or their systemic involvement. So if you pull out, you go, okay, what is a 4-quadrant way of looking at ideology? You'd have to chart all the different ways that one quadrant could take the place of another quadrant under certain circumstances. So, what's your response to that kind of an approach?
Say a little more, because I think I'm on to what you're pointing to, but I need a little bit more.
There's a famous notion of interpolation, where interpolation is where a policeman says, "Hey, you," and you turn around. And in that moment, your subjective identity becomes a function of the system.
Right.
So in a sense, the systemic zone has replaced your subjectivity, right? Or it's hard to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends upon him not understanding it.
Right.
So those are external conditions that are temporarily taking the place of a subjective condition or an intersubjective condition. And there can be a bunch of those different exchanges in a 4-quadrant model.
Yeah, and I think this is what tetradynamics has the potential of really helping to unpack and highlight. And so there's a few places in the model, in tetradynamics, where I map out different causal paths across the quadrants. So I can think of examples of where like something happens in the upper left and then it influences behavior that then has an effect on the system, and then it changes cultural relationships, right? Or, and so there's any number of causal directions, and there's different, so I think there are real ontological pathways of influence that go in any number of ways. There's also the tetra meshing element, that there are also times when these things co-arise together, and like in coaching, often if someone is like wanting to work on emotional intelligence, right? So kind of an upper left topic, the impulse might be to then assign an upper left practice, right? Of like, okay, notice your emotions and write them down, and just kind of journal your emotions at the end of the day. So an upper left practice to support building an upper left capacity around emotional, dynamics. But I found that it's often much better to use the other quadrants and assign practices from the other quadrants to influence that quadrant. So like giving them a posture practice, or having them watch their use of body language when they're communicating, right? So they're observing their physical behaviors in relationship to subjective emotional states. Or notice your tone of voice when you're communicating with people, or when people are communicating with you. What emotions do you assign to different tones of voices, and how are you interpreting that? So kind of a lower left practice to understand kind of an upper left layer, right? And so forth. Like, so I found that because all the quadrants are very connected, that you can leverage them in order to shine light on them, right? And so, the example you gave of the police officer and so forth, I think it's really interesting because it's kind of highlighting, some of these like, hey, it's kind of a, and like it's showing these causal directions across different quadrants that can unfold in different sequences, right? So that's one layer of analysis, and the other is kind of the TetraRising, right? So I think the TetraDynamics helps highlight through all of its diagrams the many ways the quadrants can and do influence the realities in the other quadrants. And they start to give us a set of distinctions that allow us expressive capacity to have the conversation you were just asking me about, right? Like, how does this show up in the context of ideology and so forth? And like, kind of, how can we better understand the mechanics, the multi-quadrant mechanics of this aspect of reality by understanding, how phenomenal realities in any one quadrant can influence or shift realities in others, and in what ways is it acausal or linear or tetrameshed? Like, those are all interesting considerations.
Your response here reminds me of two questions I wanted to ask you, one of them towards the end, but I'm going to combine them because they're both standing out for me right now.
Meta integration right here and now.
Boom!
Awesome, Bruce.
One is, I wanted just to ask you, because a lot of people are concerned that this kind of metatheorizing is impractical, and what are you offering? And I know you've got the whole embodied practitioner certification that you've done, and I've talked to people who've gone through it, and they've described the kind of the internal processes that they've engaged in that have been really personally impactful using this integral language stuff. So I wanted to ask you about that, and give you a chance to talk about what is the, that certification program. But also, Bhaskar talks about, the importance of being serious philosophically. What is philosophical seriousness? Really living as if your philosophy, your model is true and matters.
Yeah.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, what is seriousness for you in relationship to complex integral realism, to your overall approach? And to me, I feel like there's probably a connection to the kind of work that you try to take people through in the Embodied Practitioner Certification Program.
Yeah, great. So I'll respond, and then if there's a few areas that I don't get into as much as you want, then just prompt me, and we can have some back and forth to be sure to cover that, because there are several layers to what you're asking. For me, it's been really important to not, so in the Embodied Practitioner Program, we teach TetraDynamics, Polarity Dynamics, Spectrum Dynamics, and so forth. We're currently have just been offering the Embodied Practitioner Program in Brazil. right? We also have offered it, for many years in the US, but for the last few years, it's just been in Brazil. But we're in the process of creating kind of an online global version that we're hoping to launch this summer that would kind of make the embodied practitioner program, or the most recent version of that, available again for folks beyond just Brazil. It's been important to me that with each of these sets of meta models, like TetraDynamics, that there's a first-person practice that goes with it. So the first-person practice with TetraDynamics is Tetra awareness, and that's basically learning to work with the 4 quadrants of your own awareness in an ongoing active way, right? And there's a number of different practices I teach around that. But a common meditation that I'll often give is like, I have people just get in touch with their eye experience, then get in touch with kind of the relational fields that they're part of, get in touch with what they can see and hear and taste and smell in the space, the upper right, and then kind of do a systems kind of thought process of where you located in time and space, and kind of in the room, in the building, on the campus, in the state, in the country, in the world, right? And so working with these different aspects of awareness, the 4 quadrants of awareness, because for me, when someone's using TetraDynamics, I don't want it to just be a third-person model. I want it to be a third-person model that lights up those first-person dimensions in the person using the map, right? And so there's a series of meditations and practices that we teach people that go along with TetraDynamics as kind of a mapping system or an analytical system, because I really want to link the qualities of consciousness and differentiate those qualities in oneself, because the same thing that we were talking about before applies internally. Like, you need to differentiate awareness within you before you can integrate it. So I've been engaged in a number of 4 quadrant meditative practices for 20 years now. In integral ecology, there's a practice of kind of called walking in 4 places at once, where let's imagine you're going around a loop and you're going to do it 4 times. Like, let's say it's a half-mile loop in nature. The first loop, you do it just focusing on your internal experience. Then the second loop, you just focus on, what are you seeing with your senses and sensing with your senses, right? And then the third loop, you combine the 2 and you walk around cultivating an integrated first-person experience of full sensory awareness and staying in contact with everything that's arising in your direct experience internally, right? And you get good at juggling those 2 balls. And then you walk around again and you bring in a relational quality of, so a lot of practices I do, like, differentiate consciousness into just an upper left experience, just an upper right experience, just a lower left experience. And then I combine those where you kind of juggle them together, you integrate them, so you get this technicolor experience of reality, right? So the same principle applies to all the other metadynamics. So with polarity dynamics, there's several practices we have. The core one I just call polarity inquiry, which has you think of a polarity you want to work with, like masculine, feminine, let's say. So you stand in position 1. Position 2, which is just neutral, and you kind of just bring into awareness the polarity you want to work with. Position 2 is you step forward and to the left, and that's a pole, and you either assign masculine or feminine to it, and one side of the polarity you're working with. And then you stand in that pole, in that position, for, like, let's say a minute, and you just get really connected to the feminine, whatever that means for you, right? Then after a minute, you step to the right to the third position, which is now the polarity, which is the masculine. And you go really deep into just fully embedding your consciousness into masculinity, whatever that means for you. Okay, so now you've experienced both sides of the pole. The next position, the 4th position, is you take a step up to the apex of what is now a triangle, right? And you turn around and you face the 2 poles. Right. So you're kind of looking at the invisible place where you're standing for masculine and the invisible place you're standing for feminine. Right. And so now you're at this 3rd apex point, right, or 4th position. And then you embrace both poles because you've just gone deep in each one. So now you embrace both poles where you hold in awareness the full experience of masculinity and femininity in your embodied awareness as best you can. And you've just taken a big drink of each one, so it's usually pretty easy to do, right? Even if you're more familiar with one than the other, which is often the case, you're able to kind of cultivate this experience. Then, because you're at the apex, the next position is you basically, you kind of, like in voice dialogue, you shift your body, but you stay in the same position. And now you release both poles. Because initially you brought both poles together in your awareness. Now you release, right? So the first move was fullness. Now it's emptiness. And you release them both and you just identify with either, right? And you just empty awareness from either of the poles. And you do that for a minute. Now you step into the middle of the triangle so that you're equally distant from the masculine pole, the feminine pole, the both pole, and the neither pole, right? Which are the same, right? Because that's the paradox of the apex point. And now this is non-duality. This is presence, right? And so you just stay in equal relationship to all four possibilities, where you feel femininity fully, you feel masculinity fully, you feel both of them fully, you feel neither of them completely emptied out, no time, no space, right? And so all four possibilities are equally available to your awareness, right? And this is, so you start with position, then pole, then polarity, then paradox again, because it's paradoxical, and then presence. And so this is a very powerful practice of integrating any polarity you want to work with: self and other, self, no self, mom and dad, whatever. Like, I've never come across a polarity that's not a powerful practice to use in this polarity inquiry, where you use your body and you go through these positions and you integrate that. Here's the thing with integral consciousness. I've come to define integral consciousness as consciousness that can hold more polarities than any mode of consciousness prior to it. So that one of the core qualities of integral consciousness is basically holding a lot of polarities and being in that paradoxical space, right? And so this practice does a lot to support and grow and integrate the capacity to hold polarities and paradox and be present. And it really facilitates integral consciousness. And it's one of the core practices we use in the Embodied Practitioner program.
So you've got this Ken Wilber model, and it's got a great framework for including everything, but it might not fully actualize the integration of all the things that it's framing.
Right.
So then you add in something like Bhaskar, and you go, well, he's got a really good and way of dignifying intersubjectivity and digging into that. And then you integrate Morin. Each of them is sort of making up for a lack. If you don't include all those things, then something's being left out.
Yeah.
What I want to know is what's being left out if you don't include the exo and parapsychological domains.
Yeah.
What does a meta model miss if it doesn't take that stuff seriously and wrestle with it somehow?
Yeah. And it's like, that's where I've ended up, right? Because in my desire to make contact with reality, it's like I started out triple majoring, more or less, double major with a minor, right? And that wasn't enough. And then it was like, okay, now I found this integral theory thing with Ken Wilber. Like, wow, that's a really big, space to play in. And that really worked well for over a decade. And then it's like the cracks started to show. And then I was like, okay, we got to augment this with a few things. And okay, Bhaskar and Morin, those look like good candidates to kind of shore up, each other in a triadic harmonic, where they're complementing each other at multiple scales of resonance. But then it's like, I wasn't satisfied. It's like, okay, that's a good map of kind of reality as we think of it. But what do we do with all this paranormal and anomalous things that keep popping up? Like, how do we explain that? And I don't think any of those three models, Wilber, Bhaskar, and Morin, do a good job of dealing with the paranormal or the anomalous or the extraterrestrial or the, psychic or the cryptid or, so forth. Wilber's maybe does the most, just because it includes subtle and causal and the spiritual stuff a little bit more than the other two. But I feel that, that it's not really a meta model unless it grapples with that. It's not really a model of reality unless it's grappling with that, because those phenomena, those experiences are like, they just keep poking holes in our models, in our frameworks. And in fact, along with Jacques Vallée, John Keel, Charles Fort, who all basically said the phenomenon is basically fucking with us to show us that our maps and models of reality are incomplete, right? And that they're actually, the phenomenon is a catalyst for the evolution of consciousness, because it keeps pulling the rug out from what we think is reality. And it keeps saying, hey, there's a little more. You thought you had a good map or model of things, but here, let me just throw a ghost in there. Oh, okay, let's have Bigfoot run across the road. Oh, let's have, a poltergeist, okay, let's have, some abductions, it's just kind of keeps throwing things at us to just kind of keep going. Are we going to wake up to the multidimensionality of reality? And then this is where, I think the older cosmologies like the Vedas and Tibetan Buddhism, offer us a lot with, or even theosophy. It has a lot to offer in terms of maps and models of a more multidimensional reality. But then how do we upgrade those and integrate them with, current, philosophical, scientific, efforts and initiatives, right? So, and I think this is turquoise, this is the project at hand, and we're on our way to terraforming Mars. We're becoming a galactic citizen. We're opening up to all the exoplanets. And just a few months ago, there was an article on how there are 24 super habitable planets nearby. Right? They're more habitable, arguably, than Earth is to all of our biodiversity. Right. So and then you look at the stuff from the Pentagon and the UFO task force and things that are coming out of, the government with that, and I think this is the post-truth era too. We're very disoriented in our sense making, and, and it's hard to understand how to navigate through this and what are the criteria and the ways of validating stuff. 'Cause it's kind of an everything goes type of space at times. People are refusing COVID treatments because of their views around it being a hoax, and they're dying, and so it's like, how do we critique mainstream narratives while also not losing, our health and well-being in the process? So I think, there's a big difference between climate change and COVID than the paranormal and the ufological. But I think all of it's pointing to, we need a whole new way of making sense of reality, like saying something's true or not true, false or real. Those handlebars are disappearing, right? If you look, there's a recent book on deep fakes that I and some colleagues, Roger Walsh and Dustin DePerna, Adam Leonard, Terry Patton, all read together. And one of the things that comes out of the book, Deep Fakes, is how, the quality of fakes is going to be so good, video, audio, documents, in the very near future, that it can make it really hard to even prosecute certain crimes, because there's evidence that's very convincing that it's actually hard to tell if it's fake or not, right? So I think we're heading into a period where our sense making is just going to continue to get scrambled. And this is why I think metatheorizing is important and can play a role in this. And the book that Nick Hedlund and I are doing, we're actually publishing 2 volumes, and Bruce's chapter on integral grammar is in there, and is basically looking at how does metatheorizing, integrative metatheorizing, help us with the meta crisis, right? Help us navigate the multiple kinds of crises that we're facing across so many different fronts. And I think the exo and the paranormal and the anomalous is a core component to that we're increasingly going to be confronted with. And I think metatheory has a role to play in that. And the chapter that I'm publishing in the 2nd volume that's coming out, that's the result of this dialogue series between critical realism and critical theory, is basically trying to present what would an integrative meta-science of UFOs and the paranormal look like, right? And so in a sense, in that chapter, I'm trying to make the case for why metatheory needs to deal with the paranormal. So when I come out with that chapter, we can have another conversation.
That's great. Yeah, we have an author series, so maybe we'd like to have you on and talk about that book once it's out, and especially your contribution in it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you're in there too. So yeah, we could tackle both of those. Though you
Great.
did just recently do a piece on your integral grammatology, so, but there's always more to say.
Yeah, yeah. I'm at work, unfortunately, so I have to go back to work soon. I don't want to end the conversation, but I wanted to circle back to that part of the question that I wanted to ask you about, seriousness and what it really means to you.
Yeah.
How does complex integral realism show up in the serious Leela of your life?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's the thought, the feeling and sense that comes. I think the cosmos is in this process of differentiating itself into all kinds of forms of intelligence, into all kinds of forms of matter, and all kinds of forms of expression. Like that seems to be a core part of the cosmic game, is differentiation. And so for me, it's kind of like jnana yoga. Like it's the meta models help me differentiate my understanding to be in deeper contact with more facets of reality, right? And so there's just this feeling of coming home. It's like being in a warm blanket. It's like, really making deep contact with my beloved, right? And even though it's kind of driven by a mental process, like as I've talked about, I've developed all these practices to also bring it into the body, bring it into experience. I think the seriousness is like, I just want to have as much of an undistorted sense of connection with reality as possible, because that supports me as a human being on so many levels in terms of the quality of relationships, the focus in my life, like my sense of well-being, my sense of meaning making, that it gives me a big picture, but it also gives me a lot of responsibility to live in an ethical way, to seek out perspectives, to try and understand the complexity of situations. So for me, it's directly part of my wisdom and compassion practice, right? And so I just get to that through working with knowledge and knowledge systems and seeing how they can be recombined to give us a more accurate, more dynamic, more compelling view of reality. So I think the seriousness is that, like, there's a lot online, right? Like the world is on fire, like things are really bad. And so, I don't think metatheorizing is for most people, but it's what I'm best at. And so I want to bring that gift as fully as I can into the world, and then, and do my best to translate it into something that's usable, but also trusting that maybe some of that work is for others to do. Maybe that's not all for me to do, right? And likewise, it's like when I look out at people, I want everyone just to do like what they feel is their unique gift, right? Even if it doesn't make any sense to me, even if I look at it and just go, seriously, like, really, you're going to spend your time doing that, but if it is, it's just like, I want to acknowledge and support that soul spark. Right. And so it's like, I get how sometimes people will be like, well, what's the point? How do you apply it? Sometimes I'm just like, I don't know. I don't care. Like I do care, but I don't care. Like, this is just what reality is asking of me. Right. It's almost like I don't even have a choice here. Right. Like I'm just following marching orders. Like I'm just like I'm in the unfolding, and this is the direction the unfolding is going. And I'm going to honor that. I'm going to be curious, and, let's see where it goes. Like, I get paid for doing my meta modeling, so I'm able to make a living off that. So clearly at some level, it's practical and useful for others, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to make a living off it, right? Like if I, so there's some kind of validation there, even if it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. I think the seriousness is that I love reality, and I want to be in as much contact with reality as possible. And meta model building is a primary practice I use to have that contact. And it feels very serious, but I'm also very playful about it, as one might expect.
Yeah, I was thinking of the notion of serious play that comes up in my conversations with John Vervaeke quite a bit. And I think that sort of captures those two sides. They really can't be distinguished. There's an interesting relationship between having deeper contact with facets of reality and bringing those facets together to create an experience that's more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of thinking around religion and spirituality and describing it in terms of an integration that produces a surplus. So there's this numinous excess coherence produced by the integration of the valid experience of these different dimensions.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you think about the nature of that surplus experience, right? Is it being novelly generated in the moment, or is it a rediscovery of something that was already there?
I think it can be both. And I think sometimes people mistake it for being one than the other. So sometimes it can be singularly one or the other, and sometimes it can be both. I mean, one reference point I have is, the tetra awareness practice I talked about and the polarity inquiry practice I talked about. Both of them in their various forms are about differentiating awareness, right? Getting more connected to each of the four quadrants, or getting connected to the two poles, and then kind of combining them and releasing them. And a lot of people in going through those meditations talk about, because there's usually a final moment in tetra awareness practice where you then open and relax awareness and allow all four modes of experience to co-arise in your awareness. And then likewise with the polarity piece, when you stand in the middle on the non-dual presence place and you're equal in relationship to all four positions of pole, second pole, both, neither. There's people report the surplus experience often that they experience, because it's like you've differentiated awareness and then you've integrated it. But what gets integrated is something more than just this, the sum of the parts. Like there's an additional quality that people try and language and name and have on a regular basis in doing those practices. So I sense there is something powerful about processes that help us differentiate aspects of our awareness, right? You can also think of voice dialogue as one example of that. That's a process of differentiating awareness into all these different kind of subcomponents of your consciousness, right? And then big mind, and the other moments in that process that kind of bring together multiple voices, like then there's this kind of multidimensional openness that all of a sudden, is available to you. So I think that, and this is kind of one of the engines of the evolution of consciousness, is differentiation, integration, and then there's emergence. Something else is there that wasn't there before that's available. So I think that's, an important piece that and I think, Bhaskar and Morin and Wilber all include the notion of emergence as a big part of their models, right? Like somehow more of reality becomes available through some mysterious process, right? We don't really understand the mechanics of that. It doesn't seem, but I think it's important, as you're saying, that, sometimes it is actual emergence. There is surplus there, right? That's creativity. That's the, that's the void, the pregnant void, throwing more out into reality, right? Like, and I think that's kind of the 0 point that we all have access to, right? That reality is just ongoingly springing into existence, right? And in some creative, erotic way. And these different kinds of practices allow us to participate in that. So it might be discovered insofar as we're tapping into like a morphic field that others have helped kind of get going, or it might be enacted for the very first time, and then it becomes something that others discover, right? I think both occur on a pretty regular basis.
In my recent talk with Greg Henriquez, we were talking about David Michael Kleinberg-Levin's work.
Yeah.
And I think there's an aspect where when there is that emergence of the surplus, somehow it casts an echo down to sometimes archaic levels that actually brings an echo back of earlier forms that now can be recognized in the moment, so that there is this new emergence, but there's also this, in a way, a sounding of the archaic, a sounding of the deep that seems to be happening simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think this is part of what needs to be further developed in our ontological models, that some of these realities and layers, be they subjective or cultural or in the natural world, those deep structures, those kind of generative mechanisms, to use Bhaskar's word, I think, do kind of like epigenetics, like our genes change as a result of our environment, right? So that's a very powerful kind of analog to how a lot of things that we used to think were kind of static and like laid down and untouchable, there actually are influenced by any number of variables. And so like nothing is static, right? Or not inherently so. Some things might be more, fossilized than others. But that there does seem to be, part of the trajectory of science and psychology is kind of this sense of like those echoes do activate the archaic layers, and those archaic layers are transmuted as a result. And then their upward causal influence is slightly different than it was before. And then on goes the cycle, so that there's, and this is the nice, in a sense, kind of the same idea as TetraRising, that these things are complexly interrelated at multiple scales of ontological depth, that there's no layer that is, necessarily outside the scope of that influence, right? So like the thing in itself, in a sense, never exists. There's nothing outside of the enacted moment, but we have to be careful in like how we define and understand the enacted moment, so that, because, there's different contexts of enactment, and some things are outside of one context, but they're inside another context of enactment, right? But, and then this gets into challenging the idea of a mono nature and a singular world, and that we might actually live in a multiple world much more than we realize, even though we have enough referential overlap to deceive ourselves into some kind of consensual reality, Well,
other than the interactive plasticity of deep structures,
yeah.
the need to unfold exo and para studies, what's the task of the next phase of metatheoretical models? Where should people be working? What has yet to be included? What's the next step for people who are trying to think in these domains?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I'll just think out loud. One thing that comes up is there's really only three major integrative metatheories that I can think of that I've been able to identify, and that's Wilber, Morin, and Bhaskar. I feel they're at a particular level of complexity and sophistication and kind of comprehensiveness that is unmatched by anything else I can find. But that said, like at each level, from disciplinary to integrative theories to metatheories to integrative metatheories, right? You can do good integrative meta modeling at each of those scales. So I think one area is for us just to become, and again, this is differentiation, right? In order for us to do better integration is to just be more clear about like what scale or level you're working at in terms of your meta models, right? And not feel like you have to work at the, integrative meta theory level. Like it's fine to build meta models at a disciplinary level, right? Or at an integral theory level. So I think part of it is for integrative meta model builders just to get better at kind of like, where's the context in which they're doing their meta modeling. I would love to see more work done on comparing and contrasting Wilber, Morin, and Bhaskar, and seeing if we can identify any others who kind of qualify to have an integrative meta theory in the ways that I define those three as having. Because to me, it's kind of curious, like why do we only have three, and why are they all three, guys, two of them Caucasian and one mixed race, Roy, because he was part Indian. And so like, where are the integrative meta models from women and from other points of view from the global South? Or, so I think part of where we need to go is supporting other kinds of meta model building and integrative meta model theorizing that are more representative of a wider range of viewpoints other than just kind of Western white philosophy. And I'm curious, like, what would that look like, and how would that influence or contribute to, the current integrative meta theories that we have? And then I think the other areas, what we talked about is not just having them be cool maps and models, but like, how are the actual technologies of working with our own consciousness, right? And what are the practices that go along with the mapping, or what are the dialogical frames that, and I think the example that we modeled of the critical realists talking with integral theorists, like the more of that kind of metatheoretical community we can create, the better, because you can't really do this stuff in isolation in the way that you can do disciplinary or even interdisciplinary work. Like really, I think metatheory really requires a lot of perspective seeking and taking and coordinating. And you really have to be in relationship with other human beings to do that. You know, I think part of the limits of Wilber's model is he kind of did it from the comfort of his own home, right? He didn't deeply dialogue with a lot of other people. And so I think a lot of the areas where there's something missing in his model, you know, might not have been as big a gaps, you know, had his style been of kind of a deeper kind of dialogical engagement with a wider range of scholar practitioners, right? So I think our meta modeling is best served when it's not just, you know, individuals in their own minds creating complex maps and models. Like there needs to be a practice component, there needs to be a dialogical component, and we need to be more clear about kind of at what scale are we trying to play.
Those are great points. And as we expected, this was a feast. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I've really loved the questions and the engagement. Again, really happy you guys are doing this series because it allows us to take meta modeling as an object and operate on it and reflect on it and become better at it and be able to talk about it better because we have more reference points for how different people are doing it.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, and I look forward to being able to dig into some specific areas with you at some point.
Great. Yeah, me too. All right, guys. Wonderful to see you. Many blessings, big hugs, and look forward to the next time we get to dance meta.
Dancing with Sophia. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.